Hi, welcome to AI Trust Talks. I'm your host, Emma Johnson, and I'm excited to have you here. Artificial intelligence is changing the way we live, work, and connect, but with great power comes great responsibility. That's why this podcast exists, to deep dive into the critical conversations about AI safety, ethics, and responsible use. Every episode will explore the real-world challenges and opportunities AI brings, from helping business owners and corporate leaders make better decisions, to empowering data scientists to create responsible solutions, to guiding parents on how AI impacts their children's safety. This podcast is for anyone who cares about building a future we can all trust. So whether you're here to learn, debate, or just stay ahead of the curve, I invite you to join me on this journey as we shape the future of AI together. This is AI Trust Talks, where we build trust in technology, one conversation at a time. Today's guest is Michael Clark, a next economy strategist, founder, and all-round trailblazer when it comes to the intersection of AI, human potential, and the next era of digital agents. Michael is a data scholar, industry advisor, innovation and digital evangelist, and architect of the next economy, providing insights and tools to navigate data, AI, and future technologies. Michael's mission is to help individuals and organizations prepare for what's coming next and to build it better. From data and decentralized identity to the rise of AI agents, we're unpacking how we can responsibly design the systems that will shape our future. Michael has trademarked data as an asset, and today we will deep dive into what's behind that, what the cognitive economy means, AI agents, and more. Michael, I'm so excited to have you on the show today, and thank you so much for agreeing to join us on AI Trust Talks.
This is going to be cool. I think this has been coming for a while, so I'm looking forward to
it. It has. So I want to start off today by talking a bit about the next economy strategist. What led you to focus on cognitive economy, and what does that really represent?
I know, that's such a wild word, right? It went through so many different versions of that, I have to be honest, because sometimes it felt a bit uncomfortable for people. So originally I called it the intelligence economy, and your first reaction is surveillance, right? So it just felt wrong. But I think at its core, I think it's a recognition that the way we exchange things and the way our economy is moving is based on a different set of assets. Historically, it was based on labor and money, you could argue, where it feels like the new economy we're moving into is shared intelligence. It's using artificial intelligence and human ingenuity and knowledge and experience to generate new forms of data and intelligence, which can either be used for me or it could be shared with you, ultimately to generate income or some form of monetization. So it feels like we're on the cusp of what I would genuinely call an economy, because I would argue everything before this has never been an economy. If you think about the digital economy, we hear terms like the knowledge economy. They were never really economies because the way we measure the economy never changed. The only thing that changed was the way we exchange value. But I think we're in this really cool moment with AI where I would argue this is probably the birth of a new economy, or at least the evolution of the one we knew. So that's kind of why I landed on the cognitive economy, because it links into the way we think about health. It links into the way we think about finance. All of these things will fundamentally change through sharing and use and so on.
That's fantastic. And we all know that this kind of stems from data, and you have trademarked data as an asset. Do you want to talk a bit about what drove you to do this and what it means for you?
I'm a victim of my own success in some ways. I said this about 3 years ago publicly, and then all of a sudden it cropped up in so many different places. And I have to admit, many people use this term before me, but I don't think they ever went deep to understand, well, what does that actually mean as a term? And on the flip side, I also wanted to make sure that that term was used in the right way. And what I meant, and maybe other people meant, was implemented in that way. So by trademarking, what does it mean? I don't really care if it's trademarked for me or somebody else. But what it does mean, it gives us an opportunity then to actually define properly that term in its use in a nation, by an individual, and so on. So that's what it really means. And that's, in a way, that's why I did it. It wasn't really for my own ego. It was done in such a way that me and many others like me who talk about it this way have an opportunity to put those principles into practice, which will hopefully have a benefit on AI and all of us.
That's fantastic. Just coming back to data, what does the average person need to know about their own data and what is being done with it?
This is a well-documented path, though. So I don't think maybe some of the ways I'm going to describe it will be new for your audience, but I think for a lot of people, AI has kind of exposed some of these things. And I would assume deep down, we already knew this for years. It just was never in our face, right? For the average person, I think if you don't know now, I think you now know, right? The issue is that we've been giving away our data for free for a very long time. From 2003, early days of the internet, we had personalization. We had, all of a sudden, Amazon knew everything we were doing. So all of this comes from the fact that our data is being used sometimes with or without our consent. But the reality is, when we look at data, we've looked at it as a byproduct of a transaction. When in reality, I don't think people realize data is a reference of your stories, your memories, your experiences, your photographs. Like, I'm not going to get into the debate of what is data. If we assume that data is anything as a digital representation, that includes your photographs. So in some respects, data is also culture. It's a representation of our past, which we recycle constantly. So I think what people don't realize is when they give the data away, you're giving away a footprint for someone else to monetize or use. And I think we've also got lost in that word monetization, because I think when people give their data away, they also give the rights to use it in a way that that could help them or support them, not just for monetary gain. So I think that people really underestimate the power of data, but that's also because we've never been able to value it until now, which I can talk about if you want. But we now can do that, which means that changes things dramatically, particularly as we end up in the world of AI and all the things that are happening right now when it comes to data.
I do think it'd be good to deep dive into that.
In writing my book, which is out October, November this year, one of the big things I was able to do was actually value data for the first time and also price it. I've been very lucky to work with the International Valuation Standards Board over the last 6 months or so. Pleased to announce that in June, we will publish a paper on the way to value data in industry with standard terminology, which will probably be the first of its kind that eventually will be used in anger by actuaries to actually value businesses based on their data. This is one of 3 valuation standards that we'll create. Data is the first, the others will come later. AI will be one of those 3. But I think it's a real milestone, because up until this point, when we say, what's a company's data worth, we often just look at the market cap of that company. We don't necessarily look how much those data assets are actually worth, because in reality, it could be limitless. So because we can now do this, it gives us the opportunity for transparency. It gives us the opportunity to understand where data came from, but also it gives us a sense of what everybody's data is worth, not just at a business level.
Yeah. And where do you think the world is going with data?
And we talked about this before we came on air. I think this is a 2-part question. I think, where is data going and where should data be going? So if we think about where it's going right now, let's just take a view of the world as it is. If we look at data today, it's basically being hoovered up by AI LLMs, because a lot of that is required to train the model. So I was told disturbingly last week that most of the literature created in history now has been adopted by LLMs. So most of that has been hoovered up, which then leads you to the question, well, what happened to all that intellectual property, all those copyright? So we're heading into a place where, and also our culture, we're rapidly giving away data just to have access to, the big techs, LLMs and their AI. So we will freely give away data as a nation or as individuals. The danger is we're moving incredibly fast with the technology. But then the question is, are we moving further behind when it comes to our data? Because is there a danger we become consumers and not owners? Yeah. Whereas where should we go? Which then leads us back onto data as an asset, right? If we say where we want to go is, well, we recognize data as a real world asset like electricity or water, where it becomes key to everyday life. And the reality is everybody should have the right to create their own data, use it and share it, which then leads to what I would call more accurate artificial intelligence. Because if you imagine now your data is yours, or you have access to the insights that you generate, which is a better way to look at it. Now with your own AI, I now get real-time data working with artificial intelligence, which increases the accuracy levels. So we are at this really interesting crossroads right now, where we have an opportunity to decide which way we go. We either let it carry on the way it is, which is where it's always been, where there's a fight between privacy and the bigger organizations, or we take a step change and we say, well, actually, data has become so critical to everyday life. Is there an opportunity to reframe the way we look at it?
Do you think we're in a position to go there just yet? Or do you think the real decision makers in this are actually considering this?
I think they're not there yet. I think, as always, the focus is the technology. And it's always been the way. In writing the book, I had to go back, like, literally to caves, right? And if you follow the linear path, at a certain juncture, technology became the driver, almost as a byproduct of the Industrial Revolution, right? Because machines became the key to economic output. And that was then the next revolution was software, right? Which then became the key to economics. So I think in some respects, everybody's focusing on the technology as always. And the poor relation is data is kind of stuck somewhere in between. And the regulator then is always focusing on data privacy, and which rightly, because we want to protect people's rights. But then we lose something in between. It's always been a problem, but I think AI now is elevating that problem even more. And it's probably, I would argue, regulators are still trying to put a square peg in a round hole and trying to use outdated policies or outdated approaches to deal with something. It's almost like we have this joke. It's like 24th century technology versus 21st century governance. It's like we almost need to take a step back and say, okay, we know the technology's here, has huge potential for everyone, but are we missing a trick? Is the data really the gold here? And is there something we should be doing differently, not to protect it, but also not to diminish innovation at the same time?
Yeah. And as we move to a more agent-powered world and data being the fuel, how do we ensure that the data used in these systems does respect individual rights? And you've touched on privacy enough, but how do we remain that trustworthiness?
I was at an event this week, and I think one word comes up is also explainability. If you want trustworthy systems, I can have all the data in the world, but if I can't explain why an agent made a decision for me, or I was excluded from something, or I don't have the transparency, I think we're in a big problem. This concept of explainable AI will grow and grow and grow. And again, I keep coming back to treating data as an asset because, again, if you regulate that as almost like any company that touches it is almost like critical service infrastructure, by design, then all of those AI agents, you'd have to explain how they were created, right? The biggest hole in regulation today is no one is regulating the input data into AI. Most regulations focus on how the AI data was processed and what the output is. But what about where it came from? And also how its decisions are made. Some of that, as to be fair, is in regulation. But we need to start thinking about this holistically and saying, if I'm to trust an agent with my data, or even I'm to trust a business whose agent now is performing a task which before was done by a human, it's not good enough. A computer says no. You need to know transparently why that decision was made, but also be able to explain it. So I think that's going to be a huge part of what I would call trust, because I think that is the key word to all of this. I think we're underestimating how low trust is right now in technology, particularly with data use, and we have to somehow rebuild that trust. And some of that's going to come from transparency and being able to explain these things.
Yeah, agreed. And I think anybody sort of in a responsible AI safety type world for the last number of years, we've known the requirements around explainability and transparency. Do you think we've really got to a point where we're in a good position to be able to keep testing this and keep understanding that that is the right way?
Yes and no. Yes, because I think there are some tried and trusted methods. And this is where I lead into no. Again, we were talking about this off air. Today, regulation doesn't focus on agents. So that there is literally no regulation. There are some emerging in the EU, but nothing really talks about, well, what about agent to agent type regulation, when actually there's no human involved whatsoever other than making the choice what to do. And now it's agent to agents doing the work, or transparency with what agents are doing, or even the concept of an agent as a worker or as an employee. These regulations don't exist. So today, and also there's no separation from general AI to agent regulation. So we have an AI regulatory policy, but we don't have an agent policy.
Yeah.
And I would argue we're not even treating agents like employees, which is probably where we're going to have to go. Then the next question comes, well, what does that mean for HR? What does that mean for the whole thing, right? So there's a bigger picture here that I don't think we're designing for. And I think the other piece of the puzzle is, and we'll come on to, what does it mean for business later, I'm sure. But I think, there's a regulatory blind spot, I would call it, today, where we're still focusing on the world that it is versus the world that's going to be. And the question is, back to first principles, what are some of the regulations we need to do when suddenly half my workforce is not human, right?
Yeah. Now you've got me thinking about HR processes when it comes to agents, remuneration, performance improvements. So you've talked a lot about data and kind of sovereign data and decentralized identity. How do you see the future of personal data ownership evolving alongside AI?
Here's the interesting thing. So one, there's a huge misconception around what ownership actually means. So the reality is you don't own your data. The only thing you own really is your identity and some of your health data. Everything else is generated between two parties. So technically a building owns data because of its temperature data and everything else. You could argue an agent owns data, which is its operational functions and everything else. So the first thing is we need to demystify what ownership means. The second piece of the puzzle is, what does that mean for AI? I think it's huge because if we get it right, you can end up with smaller AI models that can run on the edge, but also real-time AI that gets to know the individual. Because the biggest barrier today, which I don't think people realize, is you can't take your data away. So all the LLM you're learning and developing on your device, none of that data is yours.
Mm.
You can't take that back and you can't use it. So if we want to move forward, because look, let's be honest, in the next 18 months, we're probably going to see the new app stores, which will be agent app stores, right? And those LLMs that I'm curating and building over time, I should have the right really to trade those myself because that's my data. It's learning from me specifically. Those are my LLMs, my utilities that I could trade with someone else. So once we get this right, and again, at a national level, at a regulatory level, I was lucky last year working with the DIFC where we wrote the initial paper on data as a digital asset, as a personal asset, which is kind of the first step to this. But I think it's a huge opportunity to realize the potential of AI because, again, I keep coming back to it. It'll be AI models not based on who I was yesterday, but based on who I am right now, running on my real-time data, giving me real-time insights, which I think is the logical step for us to go with more precision and more accuracy as well.
Where do you think kind of the general public is when it comes to literacy of data and the amount of people that tell me that they're posting a whole lot of stuff in ChatGPT, and I just think to myself, that it just is learning and it's taking all your data.
The real answer is it's not great. It really isn't great. When I was doing research for the book, and I've talked about this at events as well, 16% of people in the UK can't find their bank balance on a bank statement. That's kind of the world we live in. The average attention span of someone now, according to Microsoft, is 8 seconds and a goldfish is 9.
Wow.
So we've painted ourselves in a corner because we become so reliant on technology. So a lot of the skills that we need to use AI, we probably lost over time. And data literacy is one of those that's never really landed. Like if you think of the last 2 major cybersecurity attacks in the world, they were because of human error. They weren't because of some amazing technology. It's the fact that an individual didn't read a message properly or didn't look at an email extension properly. And all of a sudden now we're going to throw endless data sets to someone and we're hoping they understand what's real and what's not. And that's part of the concern. It's not about being able to read something. It's being able to stop and say, okay, I trust this, but I'm going to validate it. I just don't think that's there because we live busy lives, we're all rushing around, and suddenly we're going to have all of the potential of all of these. And let's be honest, we have to be real. There are going to be agents that are going to be used for hacking and other things because that's just the nature of the world we live in. And the question is, as me as an individual, do I have the ability to stop and pause and say, is that real? I would argue no. And I think the other concern is, are businesses doing enough for customers? So we hear a lot in the press that businesses are, big data literacy drive for employees, but I never hear anything about the customer to say, well, what are we doing to raise our customers' data literacy?
Yeah.
Because then all of a sudden then you get less security problems, but you get a more engaged customer. So I think there's so much more to do. Some of that starts in education, and then some of that starts in the customers of today and the adults in the real world and meeting them at both ends of the spectrum. Because I don't think you can do one or the other. I think you have to do both.
Yeah. I mean, we're starting to see a lot more notifications coming out, like, do you realize this is a scam, and look out for fraudsters and things like that. So the very basic literacy is starting to happen, but it needs to be a lot more amplified and moving faster. So what's your vision on how agents and AI will fundamentally shift the way we work, learn, and be as humans?
Multiple levels. So let's start with work. So I think they'll augment the workforce. The obvious things will be things that are repetitive. So repetitive tasks will be automated. To be fair, that's always been the case. We've always had workflow automation. This is almost like the next extension of that. The difference is they will be fully autonomous from end to end. That's the first thing. That also then puts pressure to have a workforce that has the skills to be able to interpret those agents and work with them and manage them. When it comes to everyday life, again, I think it's huge, right? Because the big thing we get back in some cases is time. That's the only thing that we can't replace, and that's the only thing we chase constantly is time. We'll get time back, but we'll also, again, if we do this right, we'll have agents that perform specific tasks for us. We could have an agent for our healthcare. We could have an agent that manages my money, orchestrated by your own personal AI. So when it comes to life and it comes to work, it's going to be different. It's going to be very, very different, particularly for the work environment. We're going to have to think about new competency frameworks. We're going to have to think about how we manage agents in the workforce, which I don't believe is a conversation today. I think we're still fascinated by the technology, but we're not changing the fundamentals and asking ourselves, go back to first principles. If agents are now employees, what does that mean for the workforce of tomorrow or even today? And how do we make the adjustments? I don't think we're there yet.
And with the big hype around AI and agents, what do you think the biggest misconception is that people have about agents?
Oh, I think it's the silver bullet to everything, and it'll just save your life, right? It's almost like the old days of workflow. It's like, well, we'll just throw workflow in and my business will improve by 26%. The biggest blind spot, quite frankly, is the quality of your data and the talent in your organization. Because at the end of the day, technology is just technology. No matter how advanced these agents become, they still require quality data sets, good talent, good frameworks, all the boring stuff that needs to be in place. And I think a lot of people, and it's the same for any software, they believe software is the answer to all their problems and it's going to solve everything. And that's not the case. And we've seen examples, right, where companies have laid off in the early days of ChatGPT, where they laid off, 20% of the workforce. And then months later, trying to hire everybody back again because they realize, hang on, business people still value the human touch in all of this. So we can't look at AI as a way to drive our cost base down. It can't be seen as this efficiency holy grail, at the expense of our people. So there's this at the moment, and I think this is the same for any new technology. We all run to the efficiency and the productivity. And I think that's a given. You'll get that, but not to the detriment of your workforce and the service you give to your customer. So it's not the silver bullet that most people think. There's still some groundwork and some foundations that you need to make any headway with it.
Yeah. And I always say I want AI to increase my productivity and do some of these mundane tasks because that will also improve my own mental health, give me more time back. And there's so many different positives to it, but agreed, there's a huge misconception that it will change the world and make everything a better place. How close do you think we are in truly seeing autonomous personal agents?
What's funny for me is I wrote about this like 4 years ago in like the original paper and the early manuscript. So I think the tech is close. Our adoption, though, and the things we need to put in place, I think are miles away. So I think there's this danger that the tech is going incredibly fast because one, if we think about the people consuming it, these are the same people that are content creators. They're used to using the tech and they're really pushing the boundaries because it's an extension of their work, right? And then you've got open source development, you've got access to models now, you've got big tech accelerating. But I would argue, what does that mean for ethics? What does that mean for regulation? I still believe the regulator's on the back foot. I think we're still trying to regulate something after it's happened rather than the regulator being part of those innovations. And I'm not saying to slow it down, but to be able to put the guide rails in and prepare for it.
Do the right thing.
Do the right thing, right? Exactly. I think right now the regulator is constantly on the back foot. You can't blame them because you're asking them to regulate something that not even most leaders understand. But yet they've been told, right, you need to regulate this after the fact when 20 million images a day are being created. And the regulator now somehow has to stop that without hindering innovation. So tech-wise, yeah, it's going to happen. The question is it going to happen in the right way? And are we geared up economically, regulatory, compliance-wise? I don't think so yet.
Yeah, agreed. And I think the ideas are endless on how AI and agents can support your business, but the actual getting that to production is where the time is taking because you need everybody lined up, whether it be compliance, whether it be technology, etc., along the same path. There's a massive piece of work to get everybody lined up and what the future holds. So in your opinion, what kind of governance or ethical guardrails need to be in place before we even go mainstream and autonomous?
The human in the loop is important. So I think particularly with agents, I think if we don't understand what the human wants or the human direction, then we're in for a mess, right? Because agents will just run regardless. So I think we need to have the human in the loop. We need to understand when an agent's making a decision which has an impact on human rights, identity, there has to be a human in the loop then to make that final decision. Again, this comes back to the regulator, right? If we don't even have any regulation around agents today, how can we possibly influence agent development? So again, we're back where we started, which is on the back foot again. Agents are being radically developed. But the question is, well, how are we ensuring that human in the loop, the agent knowing the individual, not being able to operate autonomously without human instruction? Like, where are those rules and where are those guidelines? Personally, I would like us to no longer focus on policies. I'd rather us look at frameworks which are adaptable over time.
Yeah.
Because the technology is moving too quick. To write a policy is great, but we all know that in some nations that can take 2 years to change, which is way too long now. It's almost like, have we moved past the point of policy, and do we need to think about adaptable frameworks that keep pace and keep step with technology and can adjust as and when needed? Like, we haven't even talked about, well, what does cross-border mean with agents, right? What does that mean for cross-border data, cross-border transactions? We haven't even touched on that. But again, that policy doesn't exist, or that framework.
Yeah.
So I think, the human in the loop, 100%, the transparency and explainability of an agent. But I would argue again, there's a lot of work to be done before even you and I can talk about agents becoming mainstream.
Yeah. Moving to trust. Wouldn't have a podcast called AI Trust Talked if we didn't cover this. So with powerful AI agents acting on our behalf, where should we draw the line between automation and human accountability?
I think I touched on it in my previous answer. I think it's about what you're asking the agent to do, right? And what the role of the agent. Once it comes down to something which is identity related or human rights or to the individual, I think at that point, the human has to be in the loop. It's the same if you were going to do workflow in your business today, right? You'd look at the repetitive tasks that don't require a human and are low risk, and I'll give it to my agent to do. The things which impact someone's life or have a human rights issue or relate to someone's true identity, I think you've got to ask yourself the question then, I think a human should be in the loop. But again, this comes back to what the regulator needs to say. Because we know in the AI regulation around the world, we have this concept of high-risk systems and different forms of regulation depending on the role that AI is taking. You could argue we need to mirror that now for the agent. Because otherwise, again, it comes back to agents just running amok and just doing all sorts with no principles or guide rails for how they operate. You and I can be having this conversation in 3 years' time around the same question. But if the regulator's not there to sort this out and say, well, actually, what's black versus white, what's orange versus red, what should we be doing under what conditions? In some respects, it's also not fair to businesses because then they're in the dark. Because every business now is going to approach it differently and have their own interpretation of what was right for automation versus what's right. Whereas we need something consistent across nations, which will be different for every nation, obviously. But again, it comes back to them, well, what do we do when an agent generates something in one market and wants to send it to another?
Yeah.
What does that even look like? Because again, we don't have a consistent consensus of an AI policy globally. Every nation takes its own view and perspective, but then we don't really, we don't take into account that we live in a global economy and a connected supply chain.
Yeah.
So in some respects, there's no such thing as made in a country anymore. It's assembled in a country and is part of one bigger supply chain. Now, what the hell happens when every part of that supply chain is an agent?
Yeah.
Like, what does that mean? So, there's a lot of things we need to think about. A combination of human and machine on its own, machine to machine, when we think of global supply chains or even localized use, a lot to think about.
I think a lot of this is coming out country where it was made versus where it's assembled when it was going into the trade wars. Not that we want to get into politics, but let's not go there. Fantastic. So what role should businesses play in shaping the responsible future with agents and AI?
This is multifaceted, as you'd expect. So the obvious one is putting in guide rails within the business, having that transparency, having the explainability, big tick. And I would also say that's not a one-off. So in my previous role, when we looked at AI, I think one of the big things is also post-implementation work. So, there's a big drive to implement AI. We also kind of got to make sure that the AI is doing what we thought it would. So we kind of got to go back again and re-audit our agents and constantly make sure that what we asked them to do is actually what's continuing to happen, or there's no evolution that we didn't expect. So I think businesses need to constantly monitor and almost evolve those agents and not just rely on a one-off deployment. That's the first thing.
Yeah.
Then the transparency and explainability. And I would argue then there's a responsibility to retain a human touch. I almost call this like intelligence with a human touch, because actually that's what's going to make this work. The feeling that there's still a human somewhere in the loop is probably going to make a lot of consumers happy. I think the other piece of the puzzle then is rethinking what we mean by a job. Because right now, we're still training people to get a job, when the reality is AI doesn't care about jobs. It's going to care about ability. So we almost need to rethink our workforce and our competency frameworks and say, well, actually, what is the workforce of tomorrow looking like? Is it, a collection of jobs, or is it a workforce of abilities and different types suited to specific agents, what you need to interpret what they give you, how you improve the model, all of those things as an organization, then how you then continuously learn and develop those people. And equally, what does it mean for HR? What does it mean for hiring? So it's multifaceted. From the work perspective, I think the other piece of the puzzle, which doesn't get talked about, it's not about extracting data from people anymore. It's about extracting their knowledge, because they're going to have a lot to bring to the table of how these agents evolve. And it may even, dare I say it, change the consulting model, because there might be now more reliance on the knowledge in the business rather than looking at external entities to provide that knowledge. So it's going to be a big change. Fundamentally, how businesses look to operate, how they manage, what they look for, how they continually improve. But then when we look outside, how they then represent themselves to consumers and how they build the trust, again, coming back to that word, with the consumer and the transparency. And I would also argue a little bit of thinking about the customer experience and the user experience.
Yeah.
And another thing that doesn't get talked about for businesses, and it kind of started, and I saw this on a podcast, and I'm going to shamelessly steal it because I love it. If you think about a few years ago, we no longer became the customer when it came to ordering printer ink, because the printers ordered it for me. So I'm no longer the customer anymore. So what businesses have to get used to going forward is the modern consumer won't be the customer anymore. They won't be the decision maker, and they won't be the payer.
Yeah.
All I will be is the person that sets the objective, and I will be the person that receives the outcome. So most businesses now need to get comfortable with the fact that in some cases, you are not speaking to a human anymore. You're speaking as a representation of the human who's performing a specific task, which could be a role in your bank. It could be ordering something online. All of these things are going to happen in the years ahead. And the question is, as businesses, what does that look like for compliance? Do you still need the human to do KYC, or are you happy for the agent to do it? Like, all of these are questions that businesses now need to start thinking about. And again, I don't know if we're having these conversations strategically in a business, because I think we're still trying to get our head around, well, what does AI mean today for my business and what do I need to do? I don't think we often think about the consequences of deploying this technology and what it means.
A lot of organizations are really looking at that baseline of their infrastructure and what they actually need to set this up, the data sources, before we're even kind of getting to that next level of agents. But in your experience, like, how far do you think we are? When do you think we can get there? Are you seeing any organizations that are really doing it well so far?
It's a tricky question because they all have their different success stories. Some of the bigger organizations, I don't want to name names, but there are organizations that have a good stable footing. So solid data foundations. You can look to Asia, right? Where I'll give you an example. In China, 2 years ago, they launched the Element X program, which was a complete focus on data as key to increasing GDP, but also to increase AI success. So you can look to the East to see the best adoptions of AI because they have solid foundations. In my previous life, I would argue everybody wanted to talk about AI, but they didn't want to talk about the basics. They didn't want to talk about fixing the data because in some respects, they'd never fixed it because it's too hard to crack. In some cases, you're talking about companies who've got 60 years worth of data in systems and they don't know what it's worth and they don't know where to start. So those companies, unfortunately, are already on the back foot because you can have the best talent in the world, but if your data's not in a great place and you can't value it and you don't know what to do with it and you can't democratize it, then all of a sudden this becomes a very difficult conversation. So I say it's a mixed bag. I think we're starting to see some of the organizations that we lead, and you probably will recognize some of those in your day-to-day life. I would argue they're on their next phase of digital transformation for a lot of banks. It's like a logical leap. It's like, and there are unfortunately some who are starting a digital transformation journey where AI is just not even in their conversation because they've got to get the basics right in what I would call the modern digital age. So I think it's mixed. Like any digital transformation, not everybody's in the same place. And we'll see the winners and losers over the next couple of years. And I don't believe it'll just because they got great AI. I think it's because they got great talent and they've got quality data sets.
And if you could embed one principle into the DNA of every AI agent being built today, what would it be?
Understand the human and their needs in terms of who you're operating for. In that principle, the agent understands what that individual wants, their weaknesses, all the things about them. Otherwise, without that principle, what is the agent going to do? The agent's just going to run off and do what it wants. So I think that's a core principle that it has to be in there. For example, if that principle doesn't exist, what if that agent is working for someone who has a disability or has accessibility needs and just goes off and assumes that agent is like me? Like, that doesn't work. So you almost have to know who you're operating for, and why, embedded as a principle. And almost as part of that principle, there has to be the human in the loop decision maker in all agents. Otherwise, you lose that control. And there are other stuff that needs to be developed around agents that don't exist today, particularly when we start talking about cybersecurity, which I know is not for today. But if we think about agents acting on my behalf, when do we get into the conversation of proof of humanity? When that agent was actually instructed by a person to do it versus it working on its own accord, or as a bad actor playing a role with that agent. Those things need to be part of its core design, at least.
How KYC is going to work in future with an agent doing the task.
Exactly. So again, which bits do you want the human involved? Because at the end of the day, sometimes you can't just discount someone because there's always a human element to this. Sometimes there's a good reason why someone doesn't have it. And if we're discounting everybody, like what does that mean for the future of banking and all sorts when it comes to inclusion, which is still not great today?
Yeah. And what excites you the most and what worries you the most about where AI is headed in the next 5 years?
All right, let's start with the positive stuff first. So I think it has a huge opportunity to realize our potential in ways that we've never explored before. Having data on your own device in real time with an AI agent that knows you is incredibly powerful. Think about it. If we think about banking products today, and I come from a banking background amongst many industries I've worked in, there's always this drive to say, right, we need our customers to understand our products. So we try and change the language. And sometimes 80% catch all, but there's still a percentage that don't get it. But can you imagine an AI that now translates those products into a way that I understand and everybody understands? That's powerful. Like being able to read your healthcare results in a way that you understand in basic English, and then being able to go to your doctor and have a possible, a very good conversation is huge.
Yeah.
But there's a flip side to everything. And the thing that worries me the most is it feels like we're brute forcing technology into an outdated economic model. And it's been that way for a while. When we came off the gold standard, there was an opportunity to measure the world intangibly, but we still measure the world tangibly. And AI is going to change a lot of things. And I don't see that in the conversation. I don't see a conversation that says, well, how are we going to measure the economy when most of the workforce is automated or, large parts of it are automated? Because today, if you speak to any economist, you look at GDP, it still measures humanity as key to output. And technology is just seen as another tool for humans to use to create output. So you can't even measure the impact of the iPhone economically because we don't measure it. But then what happens when that human labor is now an agent? And then we look at our education system. So we know that AI has been part of the curriculum globally, but I argue that we're still teaching kids to get a job. And we're still teaching the world that was, not the world that is. So most history is ignored, which is a worry, because then if an AI is going to tell me a historical event, am I going to believe it or not when I'm 15 or 16 years old? A good test for you is go and speak to a 10, 11-year-old and ask them who Nelson Mandela is. They don't know, which is very scary. You think about it. So that's education. And then we look at our healthcare system today. None of our data is connected. I can fly a rocket to space and land it between two chopsticks, but I haven't got a single view of my health. None of my data is connected. So I've got an outdated measurement system of the economy. I've got an educational system that isn't embedding continuous learning, isn't embedding some of the skill sets that we need for our society going forward. And we have a way of measuring an economy which isn't fit for purpose. And then don't get me to the workforce, where our competency frameworks and the way we look at hiring people, again, is not fit for purpose. So these are some of the conversations that I don't see happening enough. I feel we're too fixated on technology, almost looking at it as if this is just software, right? I think it's much deeper than that. And that's why I think this is a great moment. I would argue probably one of the few moments we'll ever get, because it is fundamentally going to change most of our economy. And I think there's an opportunity to take a step back for the first time and ask ourselves, what do we need in place for the next 10, 15 years? Because this sets the precedent for whatever technology follows. That's the bit that keeps me up at night. But the good thing is the opportunity outweighs my fear. But I think there's some of the blind spots and difficult conversations I think we're going to have as leaders and governments and regulators in the next 2 to 3 years for sure.
I can see where you're going with the cognitive economy now and what the work that needs to be done to kind of get the world to that place. So for people that want to prepare for the agent era, what's one mindset or skill they should start developing today?
It's my favorite. So I did this on a podcast recently, last year actually. I think it's probably, I'll give you two. The first is curiosity. Get in there and learn. These tools come out daily. It's crazy how many. And ironically, you can go into ChatGPT today and ask it to teach you how to use these tools. Almost find, whatever tool you're interested in learning with and get GPT to just teach you the steps. I think curiosity is such an underestimated thing to learn, to have in your locker, because it will make sure that you're constantly learning, which is your second thing I want people to think about. How do you continuously learn? Learning doesn't end when you leave school or university. It's a constant thing. I think over the next 10 to 15 years, the natural curiosity amongst many other skills that you need is going to be key, because it's going to be the people who are constantly learning, adapting, and using these tools will be the ones that will always be relevant. And we can't rest on our laurels as people today, because this stuff is moving way too fast. Even for the people in it. You could even argue, even for the people developing it, it's becoming hard not to differentiate bias and other bits and pieces. So yeah, I think curiosity and combining that with continuous learning will put you in a good stead. And obviously there are many other things, but I think those are two things that I would focus on.
Very good advice. And you've touched on your book a little bit today, but do you want to kind of give us an idea of what you are putting together in your first book, and then you're welcome to touch on your second book if you want to.
Yeah, the second book's happening by accident. I didn't plan this one. It's 2 years in the making, and there's a reason why. The reason why was in writing the original manuscript, I was figuring it out. So I was building a model that didn't exist, valuing data, pricing it, securely moving it around, shaping a new economy. You kind of don't do that in 6 months or so. So in a way, the writing allowed me to research, road test, proof point. And ironically, once I had it, it was like, oh, I don't like this anymore now. Because it was not written in a way that people could understand. It was almost like the writing became a means for my mind, which is not transferable to the general public in a way they understand. So I then took a step back and said, well, actually, people need to understand why first, and they need to understand what before you even get anywhere near how. So I made the conscious choice then to write the book, and I haven't told many people this, is to make it fictional and embed the facts into a fictional story that we all understand. That's the first book, and that will come out, I'm told, October, November to the general public, 2 months prior to VIPs and certain individuals, where we hope to have the drip down effect. Now, I couldn't get away from the how. So luckily, the original manuscript still exists. So it became an obvious thing to quickly follow up with the how and have a book then which is really aimed at regulators and leaders, which is a completely different audience, because the why and the what is out there. So people can understand the history of data they may never have seen before, but also some of the things we've touched on today and what that will mean and why it's so important, and actually how it's actually possible to get people thinking as well. And then the how is really the mechanics behind this, still at a reasonable level, but enough to get regulators thinking about some of these things we've touched on and many more. So that's why there is two.
Yeah. Very cool. And a couple of last captions from you, if you don't mind. What's the one piece of advice you'd give leaders that are riding on the hype of AI and agents?
I always think, look at your foundations first. Look at the fundamentals. Because I think, look, I've worked in this industry long enough. I've been the poor guy sometimes that's been brought in to implement something that the client didn't even need, because what they had was good enough. And in fact, it was doing what they needed, but they got caught into the hype cycle and bought into it. I think my first example, so my advice to leaders is don't focus on the AI, focus on the customer problem and the business impact.
Yeah.
I'm guaranteeing leaders listening to this or watching this, I can count probably on 10 hands how many times someone's coming into your office saying, I need to use AI, we need to use AI. But if you ask them what the customer business impact is or the problem or the outcome, they can't tell you.
Yeah.
Right? Because we're too busily focused on tech. And that's because it's being thrown down our throats every day and we got to be worried about it. But it's no different to any technology. We don't build solutions looking for problems. So in the first instance, what's the customer impact? What's the business impact? And what's the outcome that we're looking to achieve? And then decide if AI is the right solution to the problem. But I guarantee in most cases, probably the answer is not AI.
Yeah.
it's probably just a form of automation, or it could be simply just taking something out of a process, right?
Yeah.
So for a leader today, I would cut through the hype cycle and get people to start focusing on, what you're trying to solve, but then how does this fit into your narrative? Because I would argue there's no AI strategy really. It's just an extension of your business strategy. So you're just trying to understand, how does AI fit into where the business wants to go, and what role does that play? So that's kind of, I would, and this is when I used to sit down with leaders all the time, that if I give them my 8-point plan for AI, they'd always zoom in on business impact, because they would say to me, no one's having that conversation. I think that's where you need to start.
I think that's really interesting, because I'm seeing so many organizations go for an AI strategy, and you're saying just leverage your business strategy and see where AI fits.
I would look at where your business is trying to go, because otherwise we'll have a strategy for everything.
Yeah.
I'll have a strategy for mobile, which was correct, but I would argue then, isn't that not part of your broader digital transformation strategy, which is executing parts of the business strategy? So I'll give you that you need a pillar on AI, maybe, as part of it, but then how does that marry back to what the business is trying to do? Because otherwise you're just implementing something because you need it.
Yeah.
Or you feel you do. But I'm struggling sometimes to understand it's like data, right? If you can't prove how data is moving the needle on your business strategy, it becomes a very difficult sell over time, because the business is looking for quick returns. So if I'm going to use AI, if I can demonstrate it's driving up customer satisfaction, it's driving up revenue in certain areas, which we were going for, then all of a sudden that makes sense, because now I can see a case and I can see impact. If AI is just an innovation project, or it's just something I'm deploying to show our customers that we have it, or to hit a PR box, that's not the best use of AI. You're just using it to look good in front of your peers or whatever. So yeah, I always like to look back, even with innovation departments when I've worked in them, it's always nice to marry back to what the business is trying to do. And I mean the business as in the whole enterprise, and business units, rather than just a separate piece of work and a separate strategy.
I think you raised a good point around the benefits of AI and how that is actually aligning to the business strategy. It is, to a degree, quite hard to measure the benefits of AI, especially if it's things like just productivity or sort of recording or transcribing minutes of meetings. It can bring a whole new element of productivity, but it also, how do you put a dollar value on that?
Exactly. And like but also AI will be implemented in many different ways. So let's take a smart building. I can measure that, because I'm trying to reduce the amount of water. I'm trying to reduce the amount of operational use. Those are realistic targets. So if I can show that my AI agent is helping reduce the energy footprint by managing energy within the building, all of a sudden now that marries back to my strategy overall at a national level or a corporate level. Now AI is playing its role. But if AI is just in that building doing stuff, it's like, well, great. Is that a sales for the building? So it's marrying it back to value. Right, because that's what we're really saying. Value and measurable outcomes map back to something gives you a measure of success, whether that's productivity, efficiency, or hopefully some revenue in between.
Yeah. Michael, it's been an absolute pleasure having you on the AI Trust Talks today. Thank you so much for giving us your insights, and really look forward to your book being released later on the year.
No, it's a real pleasure. Thank you so much.
That's it for today's episode of AI Trust Talks. I hope this conversation has sparked new insights and empowered you to think critically about the role of AI in our lives. Together, we have the power to shape the future where technology serves humanity responsibly and ethically. If you have found this episode valuable, don't forget to subscribe, share, and join the conversation. Your voice matters in building a trusted AI future. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and let's keep building trust in technology, one conversation at a time.